Hey, Pastor. Does the Bible say how old someone must be to get married? Does our church have a position on that?
Certainly, we don't have a position on it as far as church. I'm kind of answering in reverse.
Yeah.
We don't have a position on that as a church. Outside of what the law says, and of course, there are laws. I don't know if those are state laws or if they're federal laws. I don't know.
No idea.
I don't know which governs. But I know there are limitations on ages now. I mean, the 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds can't get married,
Right.
in the United States. And so we would certainly follow the law on that. We're not going to violate the law of the land. As far as, why did we see people marry young in Scripture? And there's really, that's an interesting question, but it's really not a hard question. And here's why. Mary, when she was told by the angels she would have Jesus, scholars believe that she was, maybe somewhere around 14, 15,
Yep.
which for us in this day, we go, oh my lands,
Oh,
that
yeah.
is a baby, and we would think that, but what you've got to understand is in that day that, for the male, bar mitzvah for him was 12.
Right. That's a man.
He was considered a man after his 12th
You're not even
birthday.
a teenager.
Yeah. And, and a woman was probably the same, pretty close to that age, would be considered to be a woman. And, and there were fixed marriages. They were betrothed, to each other by their families. And, but here's the thing. He went through and she would go through their celebration into adulthood or womanhood at that point, but in that day, they were expected to behave as an adult at that age. They were expected to have the responsibility of an adult at that age. We live in such a very different day than that day, where, we want kids to be kids, and there's really not anything wrong with that. We want kids to be kids while they're kids and to be teenagers when they're teenagers, and adults when they're adults. And we've got this big span of age called the teenage years, where we look at that, we call it adolescence. We call it, where they're sort of in between childhood and adulthood. And they're kind of in that,
awkward.
They're sandwiched in that awkward place where they're, one day they want to get their Hot Wheels out, and the next day they want to go on a date, and it's a real weird, awkward, and you see kids that it's like one day you saw them and their mom still got their hair in pigtails, in the next day, and you're like, this is not even the same person, because they mature so quickly in that kind of that little free floating area called teenage years. In Jesus' day, they didn't have that day. They didn't have that little free floating, you basically were a child that was required to even be very responsible as a child.
Yeah.
And then when you hit 12, you were considered an adult, but it wasn't like they had just been a free floating kid and all of a sudden at 12, they just became a mature adult.
Yeah.
Kids in that day, it was an agrarian society. People worked hard. They farmed. They raised their own food. The children were involved in that lifestyle. And, and so they did mature much more quickly in this day. But, that we're not even that far removed from that in the United States. My mother and dad, I think my mom was 18 or 19 when they got married. And she may have been 18 and had my brother when she was 19.
Yeah. That was the norm.
And that was not unusual. That was pretty usual, in that day. Today is the day that's really unusual because people are getting married much later now than in past days. There's another factor in there. When we read the book of Genesis, we come away with the idea, well, my goodness, people lived to be 900 years old. And so we come away with the idea, well, man, people back in Jesus' day, I mean, they lived to be way old. That was so not that way in Jesus' day. There had been, back in Genesis, disease and illness and all that stuff was so new. It was very new. There weren't, even after the fall, there weren't those widespread diseases and illnesses and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it was entering the picture, but it had not taken off yet.
Yeah.
And so people were able to live, many, many years. By the time you get to Jesus' day, a person might become, adult at 12, but they probably a lot of times didn't live in their 80s and 90s and stuff like that, And, so lifespan today is longer than it was in that day.
Right.
So they kind of started a little earlier, in that. So, I think that's the basic reason, is because they were considered adults much earlier.
Mm-hmm.
They matured much quicker than we do in this day. And the lifespan was shorter in that day. And, so I think that set all the snare, and obviously it wasn't strange in that day. Now today, some guy pops into your house and says, "Hey, I want to marry your 12-year-old daughter." We're going to go, "You've lost your mind," and we're probably going to chase
introduce
them
you
out.
to Smith and Wesson.
Yeah, we're going to introduce them. That's right. They're going to get to meet some people, but because that would be very strangely odd in this day, because most 12-year-olds we can still consider them very much children, but it certainly was just not so in that day. So, and like I said, we as a church, if we had a 14, 15-year-old girl came to my office and said, "I want you to do premarital counseling because I'm getting married to a guy," I'd be going, "Oh, hold up, show."
No, you're not.
No, not here. You're not, and, because that maturity level is not here in this day. It's not, it's different. And by law, we couldn't do that anyway. So no, we don't have particular age, but it's certain we're not going to break the law. And if someone came to me and they were of legal age, but very close to that legal age, we would certainly counsel them well, and would obviously need to know that mom and dad and families were
for sure
in the good here too. So,
yeah,
so that's kind of how I answer that question.
So no, not really a specific number stated in scripture. And when you see young people getting married in especially the Old Testament and in the New Testament, it's more so just from the culture that kind of demanded children and adolescents to just grow up quicker. Because
they had to.
Yeah, because it's not about having fun and being silly in your teenage years. It's about growing
living.
up and surviving.
Surviving. Yeah.
So it's really just the culture. And now our culture is different because we are more prosperous, so we can afford for our kids and our teenagers to be kids and teenagers.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Pretty much hit the nail on the head.
Yep.
Perfect.
Got it.
Hey everyone. Thanks again for joining us for another episode of Hey Pastor. If you have a question about the Bible, theology, or even day-to-day Christianity, email it to us at podcast@fellowshipchapel.us. Again, that's podcast@fellowshipchapel.us. Your question may be on a future episode. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you again next week. And remember that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life.